This meeting of the Board of Internal Economy is called to order. First of all, we have the minutes of the previous meetings. Any issues with the minutes of the previous meeting? Seeing none. Any business arising from the previous meeting? And that, I don't see any, so we'll now go on to the first presentation. We have the Joint Interparliamentary Council. Are you going to lead off on this, Charles? Thank you. The clerk will lead off.
Alors, avant d'entrer dans le détail,
So before we start with the review of the decision and its impact on the main estimates for 2018-2019, I'd like to make a comment of a general nature.
there are a number of submissions to be presented today before you consider the proposed main estimates. We have thought carefully about these initiatives and have consulted with all House officers to ensure that what we are proposing will meet the needs of members, which is aligned to our new vision of providing outstanding services to members and their staff so they are properly supported in fulfilling their parliamentary functions. We have also looked at the financial implications of these submissions with a view to remaining within the existing funding allocation of the House. Without preempting your decision on these submissions, I am pleased to point out that these expenditures proposed for the main estimates of 2019-2020 will be no greater than our main estimates for the current year. Mon équipe et moi-même sont prêts à répondre à toutes vos questions.
My team and I are ready to answer your questions.
The presenters we have before us this morning, we have, of course, Yasmin Ratansi, Member of Parliament, Chair of the Canadian Branch of the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association. We have Colette Labracayel, Clerk Assistant and Director General, and we have the Honourable Hedy Fry, who is the Director, OSCE PA, Canada-Europe Parliamentary Association. Good morning.
Good morning. Before having Ms. Ratansi begin her presentation, I just wanted to confirm, normally Mr. Stanton would have been here as the co-chair of the Joint Interparliamentary Council. He's unavailable for this meeting. So I just wanted to confirm that indeed the Joint Interparliamentary Council did study these two proposals at its meeting of May 30th. The Council had a discussion in terms of the timing of these conferences, and the Council is also satisfied that the administration is in a position to be able to support appropriately these two large conferences. As well, the Council was also satisfied that the budget proposals presented to them were prepared in line with past practices and parameters for previous conferences that the Parliament of Canada has hosted. So I now turn the floor to Ms. Ratansi.
Thank you, Colette, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for allowing us this opportunity to present before you, the ask for hosting the 65th Commonwealth Parliamentary Conference in 2021. And a little background on why we are here to ask. In July of 2017, in Winnipeg, the Canadian Regional Council of Commonwealth Parliamentary Association, which is made up of the provinces, territories, and federal representatives, discussed the possibility of hosting the 2020 Commonwealth Parliamentary Conference if changes were adopted at the previous conference for a different model of hosting this conference. The last time Canada has hosted this conference is in 1994 in Banff, and then in 2004 it hosted EXCO, which is the Executive Committee, in Ottawa, and then did the two conferences in a split between Quebec City and Toronto. And then since then we have refused to host the conference until such time as changes were made to the hosting parameters. Unlike other associations, CPA conferences hosting parameters required that the host country be responsible for accommodation and meal costs for all delegates. After several years of negotiation, in November of 2017 in Bangladesh, Canada, with other like-minded partners, succeeded in introducing the new conference model. And this is a 2-year pilot project. Under the new model, the host would no longer be responsible for accommodation and all meals of all delegates. In July 2018, in Ottawa, the Canadian Regional Council of the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association accepted to offer to host the conference in Halifax in January 2021. Since there will be no conference in 2018, the first conference using the new model will be 2019 in Uganda. The executive of the CPA has accepted the proposal of the Canadian region to host the conference in January 2021 under the terms and conditions of the new funding model. Having succeeded in bringing about these major changes, it is important for Canada to organize this conference in 2021, since we have not hosted it in 16 years. As well, we are the architects of this new model for the conference, and we would like to test it where necessary and help improve it going forward. The hosting of this conference by Canada will help demonstrate our leadership role in the Commonwealth, and we have done a lot to move the leadership and governance needle forward. There will be approximately 500 participants. The conference will consist of 6 elements: the Executive Committee, Small Branches Conferences, Commonwealth Women Parliamentarian Steering Committee, plenary and workshop sessions, the General Assembly meeting, and Society of Clerks at the Table Conference. The estimated budget before you have been reviewed and approved by the Joint Interparliamentary Council and by the Canadian Regional Council of CPA, and efforts have been made in the budget to reduce the costs. The funding model for the Canadian region involves a 50-50 sharing between the federal branch and the 13 provincial and territorial branches. As part of the funding model, the Parliament of Canada provides the Secretariat for this conference. Our ask for the fiscal year 2019-2020 from the House of Commons is $77,081, or 35% of the total budget, and $426,971 for the year 2020-21, which is the year that the conference would be implemented. So the total cost to the House of Commons would be $504,052. The province and territories will also have to do a similar approval process. This completes my presentation, and I am prepared to answer any questions you should have. Thank you.
Should we do both first and then have questions? Is that the wish of members? Okay, Ms. Fry.
Thank you very much, and thank you for listening to my presentation. It's my pleasure, actually, to bring forward the concept that Canada should host in 2020 the big, which is a large conference, a summer conference of the OSCE-EPA. OSCE is the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and the Parliamentary Assembly is a very large one, so that we are looking at something like 700 delegates coming from 56 nations. I think it's important to note that the OSCE is the world's largest regional security organization under Chapter 8 of the United Nations Charter. And so we were asked 2 years ago by the OSCE-EPA to host this conference, the summer conference, in 2020. Now, there are 3 conferences hosted each year by the OSCE-EPA. One is in Vienna. It's called the Winter Meeting, and it's always sort of very much like a business meeting. The second one is the Summer Conference, which is the one we're asking about. And the third one is a fall conference, which highlights issues dealing with Mediterranean problems and Middle East problems. The event that we are asking to host will bring about 700 people, as I said, from 56 nation states. Now, Canada and the United States are the only 2 countries outside of Europe and Central Asia that is involved in the OSCE. In fact, we were very long time ago, 40 years ago actually, responsible for bringing about the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which was to deal with the Cold War at the time. It is really important that Canada plays a role. We were asked to do so because Canada is seen as having a huge role to play in terms of some of the big issues that are being dealt with now. Cybersecurity, foreign interference by countries, as we know, such as Russia. When we look at Europe, intervention in elections, intervention in the business and security of nation states. We also are looking at the fact that there is a an extreme set of governments across Europe that are no longer wanting to be involved in democracy and democratic institutions. Canada has a huge role to play within that sphere. We now note that the recent aggression by Russia against Ukraine, once again, is a big issue. Canada is seen as a major player in this forum. And so the issue of freedom of the press, the issue of the democratic institutions are at play here in this particular meeting. The last time we hosted a fall meeting was about 30 years ago. And so Canada is really supposed to come up and belly up to the bar now. And the reason is, of the 56 nation states that make up the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, very many of them are not capable of hosting this kind of event, because we're looking at countries that are recovering, Bosnia and others from conflict. We're looking at Central Asian countries that just don't have the capacity or the resources to host it. And many of the countries that have hosted it are now hosting it again for the third time, and we have really been lax in playing our role over the last 30 years. So Germany has hosted it twice. We have seen Austria host it twice. We've seen France host it. We have seen Belarus in the Russian, near to the Russian Federation host it. So we have seen quite a lot of countries doing this, and I think there's also this concept that we're not playing our part if we don't come up and do this. The cost of this conference is detailed for you, I think, in your presentation that you were given beforehand, but I will be very happy to answer any questions, and I think this is a current and timely conference for Canada to be hosting in view of some of the security issues that we're facing globally. Thank you.
Ms. Bergen.
Well, first of all, thank you both. Thank you, Ms. Fry and Ms. Ratanzi, for being here for your presentation. I'm a member of both of those associations, and I think that conferences such as these are very important, and I think it's also, as you articulated, it's really important that Canada plays a role, and although we, I think, already do a lot of heavy lifting, we want to continue to play that role. Unfortunately, and through no fault of your own, there is an underlying issue right now that has not been resolved, which means for me, I don't know how other members of the board feel, but I don't feel that I can proceed with approving these funds. There was an issue that arose at our last BOI meeting 4 weeks ago. JIC came to us to present their annual report. I, at that time, or my colleague, tried to raise an underlying issue whereby these very important associations that have been operating here on Parliament Hill for many years and operating successfully had been turned into a political mechanism. And so we felt that we needed to address that here at this BOIE because we are asked to approve these funds. We were not allowed to discuss it. We were told it was out of order. And to my knowledge, those issues still have not been addressed, and there's no resolution. And so, unfortunately, and this is the taint that has now come to be borne on these really good associations, is until we can find resolution to how these associations are not allowed to be politicized and rules broken, and even just, I don't know now where we can discuss it, because perhaps if the ruling is we can't discuss JIC at BOIE, perhaps there's another place to discuss that, but I have not been informed as to where that is. So until that issue is solved, I know my thoughts are I want to see these initiatives go forward, but the underlying issue has to be addressed so that that type of thing doesn't happen again. Thank you.
Mr. Strahl.
Just to add briefly to my colleague's excellent summary, while JIC does, I understand the Joint Interparliamentary Council does conduct their meetings in camera, we can take from the minutes of those meetings that the matters that were raised regarding governance have not yet been resolved. There is nothing to prevent the type of fiasco that happened as a result of the October 30th meeting of the NATO Parliamentary Association, which was directly related, unfortunately, and did cast a pall over the NATO annual assembly that was conducted in Halifax. And I believe much of the dispute involved that. And just to be clear, We understand that the majority of the members on the NATO Parliamentary Association wish to have a change in the chair. However, the way that it was done broke every rule in the book, and there was no recourse for members of Parliament. It was simply a tyranny of the majority. And until such time as the Joint Interparliamentary Council addresses an issue that would prevent that from happening again, or provides for recourse and appeal mechanisms for members of Parliament that respect the fundamental rules of members of Parliament, no matter what party they're in, having access to an pre-established set of rules and regulations, and that meetings cannot simply be hijacked for political purposes. It really is an unfortunate politicization of these nonpartisan organizations that have done great work for Canada and for parliamentarians the world over. So until such time as JIC is able to come to a resolution on that issue, on the ability of members to have a satisfactory dispute resolution mechanism that is built into the rules and regulations of all of the associations, we cannot approve any funding for JIC or indirectly to these types of programming. So again, this is no reflection on these organizations. There's no reflections on the excellent reports of their chairs. It is simply a matter that has unfortunately been allowed to fester, and we need to come to a solution. And perhaps this will provide the impetus to JIC to do that work, to work with the Deputy Speaker, the Senate, and all the members of the JIC to recognize that this is not something that just because a meeting happened, that this has gone away. So this is a live issue for us, and one that we would hope will be resolved quickly so that we can get on with the job of these important associations to conduct their business in a way that respects the rights of members and respects the nonpartisan nature of these organizations.
Mr. Holland?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would say that there's obviously a significant amount of disagreement with the way that the events were characterized, but it was your ruling in the House as to where these matters should be adjudicated. First, it should be dealt with at GIC, and then if it was unable to be dealt with there, it would be brought here. The reality is that there was a decision made by the NATO Parliamentary Association that they wished to change their chair. It was within their right to make that request. They may not like the fact that a majority of the members made a different decision with the chair, but I think it's most unfortunate that this body, which is nonpartisan, is having this issue brought into it, and most unfortunate that we would suggest that we should hold hostage important matters of diplomacy and work with international partners because a chair was lost. Now, we had conversations. I thought that accommodation was found in Halifax. I thought that we had moved forward in this. I think that there are ways to adjudicate this matter that shouldn't interfere with the business of the Board of Internal Economy, which is not designed or have purpose to air grievances of a partisan nature. And I think that this is, a most unfortunate direction that we would, on a partisan issue, decide to hold hostage the agenda of this body.
Before I go back, I just want to clarify one thing. I think the ruling, I think you'll find that it, if I recall correctly, indicated first that these matters should be dealt with at the associations themselves, if possible. If not there, then at the Joint Interparliamentary Council. And then if that didn't work, then it could be brought here. And we could have the JIC come back and report to us if things, and it may be possible, after I go to Ms. Bergen, it may be possible to hear from Madame Lebrec-Riel whether there's anything to report from the JIC in relation to this. But I'm first going to go to Ms. Bergen.
Thank you. A couple of items. I think Mr. Holland's comments, I think, is proof as to why this has to be rectified, because the way we view what happened and the outcome and the ramifications, not only to individuals whose rights were trampled on by the tyranny of the majority that night, but also to the rights of future members who could be at risk of having that happen. I think it's clear that this has to be resolved. And if not here, then where? This BOIE has been made public so that issues like this could be discussed and rectified in a transparent and in an open way. So this is where it should be discussed. Now, I would suggest we probably should have discussed it 4 weeks ago, but the decision was taken and was respected that it was not in order for some reason. Clearly, it needs to be discussed, and it needs to be discussed openly. The reason is so that we can then proceed in carrying out these great good work that we're doing and have done in a nonpartisan way. My other point is not only does it have to be rectified for the future, but the wrong that was done to individuals that night does have to be held, someone has to be held accountable, and that has to be rectified so that it is clear to everyone. I believe that it should be clear to everybody that it won't ever happen again, because here's the truth. This time the majority happened to be the Liberals. Next time it could be, the majority could be the Conservatives that could then exert tyranny over the minority. And whoever is the victim, it's not right, and it needs to be fixed.
Just before I go on, just to be clear, this was raised in the House, and therefore I made a ruling. The ruling indicated, as I said, that this should be dealt with first at associations, if possible themselves, then, of course, at the JIC, and then, if that didn't work, then at this. But we have not had a report from the JIC on this matter, and I think it's appropriate that that be the process, and that was the ruling. And I would expect members to accept that that's that. Now, having said that, there's no question. We know how this body works, that it works by consensus. And if there are members who do not feel that they can approve expenditures, then those expenditures don't go forward. And that's the nature of the body, and that's there's no escaping that. So that's fine. And I'm not sure how far we want to get into this at this point, but I see Mr. So can we go to Ms. Lebrecq? Mr. Straw.
Well, obviously we always respect the ruling of the chair, of the speaker. I would just ask the question: what would be the deadline for approval of these funds to allow for the planning and procedures to go ahead? I think we have some time, and I believe that it will actually benefit the JIC and these associations to know that they do have a deadline to come up with a satisfactory resolution to the issues that were raised by the Speaker's ruling, and perhaps knowing that we can approve this funding for the next fiscal year at any time before that fiscal year would give appropriate deadlines to both the associations involved and the JIC so that they could comply with the Speaker's ruling and get this resolved in a way that would allow us to be comfortable to approve this spending.
Madame Rebecca.
So I'd like to address that question first. In terms of timeline for both of these conferences, what was not shown or what was not necessarily mentioned was that the funding strategy, and it's the same for the two conferences, the planning year, which is the next fiscal year, is being funded not through the main estimates process. It's being funded through what are anticipated surplus funding from the associations and exchanges budgets. So the request for planning year funding in terms of the amounts of the expected costs, is not necessarily an issue here. However, we cannot incur any cost towards a conference unless Parliament has given its approval that it wishes to host. So the funding matter is a secondary question. The first question is, do we want to host, which would allow my team, for instance, to start engaging expenditures, whether it's main estimates funding or current funding. So that's the first question. The other issue is with regards to the international secretariats. If Canada does not come with a decision very, very soon as to whether or not it intends to host these conferences, both of these associations will be left scrambling to find another host country, and the timeline is quite significantly tight. So there is a pressing, it's not necessarily the financial matters that are pressing. It really is the effect internationally of not having a decision in a timely fashion. The funding request for the temporary funding of the main estimates process really doesn't kick in until the second fiscal year. But again, we cannot incur any expenditures, whether current funding or new funding, without the authorization to first off host this conference. In terms of the questions with regards to the specific issue of the NATO General Assembly meeting of October 30th and what, if any, the JIC has moved on this issue, I can confirm that the JIC did have a meeting on November 7th. That meeting, however, was held in camera, so I'm not able to reveal any of the discussions of that meeting. However, the conference did occur. As Mr. Holland alluded to, there was an arrangement for that conference in terms of the head and deputy head of the Canadian delegation. And the last element would be that the executive committee of the NATO Parliamentary Association held a meeting earlier this week, and so it has resumed its business.
I have Mr. Holland and Ms. Jager.
So just to be clear, first a question and then a comment, if I could, through you, Mr. Speaker. So when you say that the timing is pressed, that there is an urgency associated with this, how much time do we have? In other words, if this matter was deferred, when would a decision have to be made before it would seriously endanger both these conferences?
The 31st of December this year, at least for OSCE.
January would be fine. January 2019 would be fine for us.
So that gives us obviously a very limited window in order which to make a decision. Otherwise, this would be scuttled. I would posit to you that there was a process that you laid out to determine whether or not the Parliamentary Association meeting was conducted appropriately and whether or not the election of a new chair was conducted appropriately. Certainly, it's my position that it's the opposite of tyrannical for an association to be able to duly notify that it wants to establish a new chair and to have an election. But that having been said, I'm disappointed. I thought that we had discussions and had come to an arrangement on this. The process that you laid out, though, is on a separate track. We've heard now that the matter has been heard. We don't know, because it was in camera, what the decision was of GIC, but if there is a place to take it further, my presumption through you, or to you, I should say, Mr. Speaker, is that you would then be in a position to determine whether or not it would be heard here. If there is some disagreement with that decision, that's the process you laid out. I'd be fully comfortable hearing that matter here, but it seems very seems to be very preemptory to hold hostage this process when we haven't even concluded the process that you had laid out. So I guess the question that I'm putting to you on the concern that has been raised by my Conservative colleagues is, if they are in disagreement with the decision that was presumably was made in the in-camera meeting, they would have opportunity to raise that at our next board meeting, I would presume.
Well, sorry, if you're saying, I mentioned earlier that the JIC could report to the board. Now, there's a tentative meeting, or the meeting planned, I gather, for next week, at which we could ask the JIC to report on this matter. I also said that members have, they're entitled to take their position on issues that come before the board as they wish.
So my suggestion on that basis then is that we ask for a report from JIC on this. If there's a desire to continue to till this earth, then I have no problem with the conversation being here. But it seems odd to me that we would, before that process is even played out, the process that you spelled out that has been moving through is played out, that we jump to the conclusion that somehow that process was incorrect when they haven't fully adjudicated it, or haven't fully moved through the process that you had outlined, and then we're in the meantime going to jeopardize two conferences on this matter. I mean, that seems to me that doesn't make any sense to me. So what I would suggest to my Conservative colleagues is, let's deal with this. There's a process to deal with the other. I have no problem with it coming to get a report from JIC. And then whatever that report is from JIC, we can have a conversation about the NATO matter. But I don't think that that as that process plays out, it should hold up our business here, or that it should be held hostage.
Mayor.
I have questions in regards to the presentations. Is that suitable?
I think you can proceed with that.
So I do want to just, I want to first of all say thank you as well for your presentations. I am in support of Canada hosting these. I think we are playing a role on the international stage, and to have so many countries and come to see our great country is an opportunity that I am supportive of. The question I have is in regards to looking at expenditures of the past versus now. So thank you for outlining what the expenditures would be now. I know, Mr. Tansey, you've mentioned that there's a new model, and I'm wondering if we know the expenses from the last time we hosted it in 1995, looking at inflation and so forth, but removing the expenditures of hosting. And Dr. Fry, I would ask the same, if there is a comparison as to what are we basing this off of? Is it based on the last conference hosted in another country, or is it based on what we are doing in this country? But I would reiterate that it sounds like there isn't a way forward that we can ensure that we are having that meaningful dialogue that's necessary. I think it's also important to note that JIC has met and there was some outcomes that came out of it, and that NATO has also continued to proceed. But I also do defer to your ruling, Mr. Speaker, and I would agree that there is a way forward, but it should not hold up the work that we need to do here.
So to address the question of funding and comparative analysis, so as you saw, the last time that Canada hosted either of these two conferences was some time ago. I do not have with me the actual expenditures for the 2004 conference, for example, of the CPA, because it was a different type of conference. But the model back then, as mentioned by Ms. Ratanzi, called for the host being responsible for paying accommodations, so the hotel costs and all the meals throughout the entire stay of all delegates. So you can imagine how costly that would have been. The new parameters being proposed for this conference remove that responsibility from the host country, whereby each delegate will be responsible for their own accommodations, and there are only a few meals that are being imposed upon the host, if you like, as part of the hosting parameters.
And so as someone in the past who has also planned conferences, perhaps not to this magnitude, there usually is a line-by-line item. So what I'm saying is there must be some record, I would hope, of expenditures being able to remove the items that are no longer the responsibility of the host country. I'm just wondering if we have taken a look at those, taken into consideration where we are. I have no doubt that you have tried to be as efficient with the resources that you are requesting. I know that you do your due diligence. I have full confidence in members and that such. So I would just love to know. And then I would just take it one step further and ask, what is that delegate fee for countries that are coming, or is there one?
In the past, there has been no delegate fee in the past model. So just to remind you that Russ Hebert and Joe Preston were both chairs. And in 2007, we refused. At 2007 in Malaysia, we actually were going to walk away from Commonwealth. But then we persevered, and we have worked hard to ensure that the governance changes take place. So with this governance model, we're not going to charge them any delegate fee. However, spouses at the Bangladesh conference that we had, the spouses were to pay about $1,300 US, and the observer status was $3,000 US. And we will have to come up with a balance. We have to discuss it with our international headquarters as well as to how to manage it.
May I ask you, please, to provide us with the information, perhaps not today, but over the course of next week, the details that Madam Jegg requested. Thank you. Yes, absolutely.
Respond because the OSCE EPA works on a very different model than the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association. The host country is responsible for accommodation and meals, and of course any entertainment such as cultural attractions or whatever in the summer meeting. And it's a chance therefore in a country like Canada to showcase our diversity as a nation with all of our diverse cultural things. I mean, it would be very interesting to see Ukrainian dancers, you know, at this and let them know that we can do this in Canada and that we have this kind of diversity. However, I think given that the last time we hosted this conference was 30 years ago, it's pretty difficult to compare. The rules have not changed. And when you look at what goes on, for instance, in Berlin last year, some countries undertake to do more than they're required to do. For instance, Berlin turned over the whole Bundestag to the meeting. And so the cost of the Bundestag and all of the people, the clerks and everybody who worked there was absorbed by the country because they wanted to showcase their beautiful parliament. So you can do what you want, but the baseline is accommodations and meals and entertainment if it is possible. So it is within those kinds of parameters. As I said, countries can, if they wish to, do whatever they choose to. But we have tried to be fairly you know, sit within the parameters and the baseline of what is possible, knowing, understanding that we don't want to go around spending maybe as much money as Germany feels that it could spend. But we will follow the baseline requirements, and we intend to have a lot of say in some of the issues that are going to be discussed at that meeting, and we have that opportunity to do so.
Mr. Straw.
Yes, I'd like to thank both presenters for giving us the deadlines that we can work towards to get these matters addressed prior to approving these conferences, which we do want to do. We just simply believe that we need to deal with some governance issues. This, in spite of some of the previous comments, if I can perhaps provide. I don't want to get into the whole thing. I've made a lengthy presentation in the House. Our views on this are known. This is not about one chairperson being removed. Conservatives are good at math. We understand that the majority is held by the Liberals, and that if they wanted to make a change to the chair, that there was a proper way within the rules to do that, and that those rules were breached is the issue that we're talking about. And when members feel the rules are breached, what is their recourse? And the speakers laid out some path forward. I would suggest that that path be accelerated to meet these deadlines so that we can get back to the good work that the Joint Interparliamentary Council and their member associations do. So that is where we are. We would be happy, we have a meeting next week to discuss business. We've in the past done a walk around where we have signed off on expenditures. We would be happy to participate in that as well, should more time be needed to resolve the matters that we've identified here today.
Thank you. I think that, do we have a consensus that we would ask the JIC to report on this next week? That's agreed. All right. For now, then, we'll thank the witnesses, our guests today. Merci beaucoup d'être venu. And we're going to go on to the fourth item on our agenda, which is services to members. And we have presenting l'honorable, excusez-moi. Il sera très content, hein? I'll take it. Promotion. On a Pierre Parent.
The Honourable Pierre Parent, Human Resources Chief Officer. He's going to introduce those officials with him. We also have Stéphane Aubin. No, not yet, a bit later. Mr. Parent, the floor is yours. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Human Resources Officer of the House of Commons, along with Robin Degg, who would be leading this new team if this proposal is approved by the board, to propose the establishment of an HR advisory service and programs to members of Parliament to assist them in fulfilling their roles as employers. As you are aware, members have a unique role as employers of their staff in their constituency and ill offices. That being said, HR services provided to members by House administration are currently limited, and the existing service delivery model does not support the needs and requirements that are being expressed by members right now. De plus en plus, les députés sollicitent des conseils.
Increasingly, members of Parliament are looking for advice, guidance and resources to help address human resources issues, which is the case for all employers, and members are subject to increasing pressures to provide for a healthy workplace. Now, a consultative process when it comes to human resources will help members play their role as an employer and also to contribute to a positive workplace.
Establishment of new HR services to members, including a team of dedicated senior HR consultants who will be responsible for building a partner relationship and addressing the HR needs of members. HR advisory services would range from offering recruitment tools and support, assistance in managing sick leave, accommodation, and mental health situations, enhanced orientation services to support members and their staff, employee relations advice, and navigating conflict and harassment situations. The launch of the team of senior HR consultants would occur at the end of January 2019 if this proposal is accepted. This team will be available to work with the members and implement relevant tools and programs. A review and changes to the existing onboarding practices is also underway in preparation for dissolution and post-election activities. Over the past year, we've both been directly involved in assisting members with various files and can attest that these types of services are long overdue. For members to be effectively carry out their role as employers and ultimately their role as parliamentarians, they must have access to the same type of HR support as other employers, with advice and guidance based on sound HR management principles. By making adequate tools and programs available, we will place members in a better position to navigate difficult situations and address issues as they arise. We are happy to take any questions at this time.
Just to put this in context before I go to Mr. Holland, it's long struck me that one of the most important things we do as members of Parliament is hiring our staff. They are, the first point of contact for our constituents. They provide a lot of services to our constituents because we're here a lot as parliamentarians, and all of the aspects of human resources are areas in which most MPs, when we start, haven't any training particularly. And I had the good fortune of having had a sister who worked in HR, and I learned a lot from her. Even got some good materials. Did that make me better at doing interviews and hiring? Hopefully it did. I think over time I've improved in that regard, but I'm sure there are things we could all learn and be better and do better with in terms of managing these issues generally. So I want to put that context that I think there's some value in this, but I'm looking forward to hearing from colleagues about it. Mr. Holland.
Thank you very much. Well, I want to, first of all, through you, commend the work that's been done. I think it's vitally important. These are changes that are badly needed. And perhaps what I could do, just stepping back for a moment, so it's going to take me a minute to get to a question, if that's okay. I would outline, as I have in conversations that we've had offline outside of this place, what I think the ideal circumstance is, what I would like to see us move towards, and perhaps you could articulate how far this gets us to that. It's long been my observation. In fact, my second job after building fences was as a summer student for a member of Parliament. So I've had some experience with this over the years. I think for any organization, for example, when I was executive director of Heart and Stroke, we would have a centralized, job bank where there would be people could look at what employment opportunities would available. We would hold on to resumes, so that if somebody didn't work out for one position, we would hold on to it if it may be for another. We would ensure that all positions have job descriptions. If we were creating a new position, the first thing you would do is create a job description, understand its reporting relationships and its requirements, and put it out. You would then have a screening process that HR was involved in to basically look at whether or not the candidate that is applying for the job and through an interview, an initial screening process, actually has the qualifications for that job. These are things that are not available that I think would be essential as a resource for members to utilize. We don't have a performance management system, so the reality is at the beginning of a year there's no goal-setting process. And because you don't have a goal-setting process, then you have no process of evaluation, which means that any of your compensation is not rooted in any sort of evaluation of performance. So that is not present. And then there isn't there's HR support in the sense that if somebody has a problem, they can call your office, but there isn't anything in the way that somebody would sort of in a workforce out beyond this place would recognize, where you would have an HR advisor who you establish trust with, who you have communication with, that when you have issues that you would then discover that through conversation. Because one of the things that we've found when we've talked to our own employees, there's Women on the Hill and others who've done this work, is they don't know where to go. They're very reticent to go up to the Chief Human Resource Officer or to the whip or the Chief of the Staff of the whip. It seems like a very nuclear option to them, and so therefore they're not reporting. And as a result, very minor issues become larger and larger and larger before they become something much more significant. So one of the things that concerns me in this, and I know I've already related in conversations prior to this meeting, is that if we have 8 HR consultants against 2,000 political employees, that's pretty hard to do proactive work or trust building. Those 8 people might be able to have 1 half-hour conversation with that entire group of 2,000, but they certainly aren't going to be having the kind of in-depth conversations to build trust, so that on a maybe not day-to-day basis, let's say month-to-month, week-to-week basis, as they're encountering challenges inside of an office, they have a conversation. And I see that as being two-dimensional. In other words, that there is both the need on the part of the member to be able to get support in how to manage their staff or get associated training, but there is separate and apart from that the need for staff to be able to have somewhere to go to say, how do I manage this issue, either with another staff person or, in fact, with their employer, if it is indeed the member. And then I would see where we encounter problems, the need to be able to have environmental assessments, or to take a 360 view of what is happening within the office environment, that they would then be able to come back to us, as a whip, to be able to say, okay, there needs to be training, or there clearly was a lack of understanding of how to deal with this particular management issue. Be able to actually understand the source and root of the problems when we have issues that come forward to us. So obviously I'm speaking kind of in fast forward and generalized terms. Really what I'm talking about is professionalizing our HR services so that they would mirror and would be reflective of what we would see elsewhere in the world. I recognize that this place is special and it is different, but I think that having these kinds of services is essential, and I think in the wake of C-65 and in the wake of, I think, expectations that people have in terms of what happens here, and that these things are rather quite essential. So there's where we are, there's what is in front of us today, and I've sort of articulated, at least from my perspective, the ideal paradigm. How far does it get to that? And maybe specifically speak to this concern that I have that 8 people against 2,000 we're not, I mean, basically they would have to be sitting by the phone waiting in a reactionary way for people to call them. There would be no element of proactivity in that. And so what would it take to be able to proactively have an opportunity to be reaching out, building that trust, establishing those relationships?
Thank you for your question. The proposal that we have before you is one that would allow us to start to learn how to serve members, because we're opening a line of business that doesn't exist right now. I'm absolutely 100% sure that if you look at this team a year, 18 months, or 2 years from now, it will be slightly different. And if you like what you see, if we create this team, we'll come back and we'll ask for maybe more resources. But right now, the evaluation that we've made in accordance with what we know from each of the three recognized political parties is that there will be somewhat of an usage. And with regards to your question regarding the proactivity part, there is currently a service which is called Finding Solutions Together. It was extended to members and their staff in 2014 when we had the policy on preventing and addressing harassment approved by the board. So the board had made a decision back then to extend that service to members and member staff. So it does exist. It is used by some of your staff. In this proposal, we do have at least depending on one resource, direct, and 2 indirect, that would be added to this team in order to be proactive. I think right now it's more getting that service known. And we got the same message, is that sometimes your staff don't know where to go. So we do acknowledge that there is a need for us to better promote our services, but they do exist. And if the intent is to have this service grow, we'll come back with a proposal in the future.
So there's a couple of points on that. So one is, if we're approving where we are today and there's an acknowledgement that we're on a journey, then seeing that roadmap would be helpful so that we can see where we are in that and where we are potentially going. Because I don't know about how other members feel on the board, but if we're approving something today and it's not the final iteration, then seeing the map of where it's going and having an understanding of what the associated costs are, if we're opening up a new line of business, then being able, and I understand that some element of that might not be clear, but I think, I think I would like to see a generalized roadmap so we can understand the road we're beginning to walk, because this is clearly the first steps in a journey, not an end destination. And so I would want to have a better understanding of that. The second point that I would make, and maybe I'm not making it clear when I'm talking about an HR consultant, and not to keep harkening back to my time at Hart Stroke, but one of the things that we did is there was an expectation that every employee have a regular status update with somebody from the HR team, and that happened on a proactive basis, whether or not there was or was not an issue that was occurring, and that would take place, I don't know, every 3 weeks or something thereabouts. And that's the level of proactivity that I'm talking about having available. And the reason is that if somebody, let's take an example of sexual harassment or verbal harassment or physical harassment. Somebody can feel intimidated. Somebody can not feel empowered to come forward. They may not feel empowered with the existing structure in terms of, jumping to somebody they don't know. And there is the reason why these things exist, and I'm using that as an extreme example, is you establish trust with somebody so that you can understand the process, how you're protected, how you can come forward. The second element of that is there's a much more tactical element. And particularly in light of the issues that we talked about, and I think the speaker was quite right, many people come here without management experience, where they do need help and where there is issues happening on a day-to-day basis where they're not sure how to navigate them. My goodness, this happens with people who are very experienced managers, where they require the resources of human resources. Effectively, what we have right now is I understand it, is sort of a reactionary force that when we have problems, then people are going to pick up the phone, rather than a proactive force that exists on an ongoing basis, establishing trust, so that on a regular basis those conversations are taking place. So when you're dealing with a small issue of management, or how do I talk to an employee about an issue that I'm having, or how do I deal with my manager, or how do I deal with mismatched expectations, that there's that opportunity to deal with it. My reflection today is that if everybody used the services as they're used outside of this place, that we would collapse in about 4 seconds, because there just is no way that we could operate that way. So what we do instead is we operate without those supports, and I would posit that is a dangerous proposition. That's not a healthy proposition, and that is a major concern for me. And so I recognize that we're not going to change that overnight, but that brings me back to the broader question of a roadmap. And I think if we are going to approve something, then I would like to see where we are on that journey and how we're going to address these issues on sort of a broader basis.
Parent, I just want to suggest to you that I don't think there is a roadmap at this point. I think that part of maybe I'm misunderstanding, okay, but it strikes me that what's being offered here are things that members can have access to, right? Now, it may be that we want to offer members training in relation to their management in terms of human resources. Okay, I think that's very valuable, so that they know when they want to call upon this kind of assistance, right? I don't know if you're talking about going beyond that to a point whereby maybe we're not imposing, but I don't know if you mean, that we would require members to do certain things, and that becomes more problematic because members have, their individual responsibilities and their rights as members to manage things as they see fit. provided that they don't do something wrong in relation to the kinds of things you talk about, harassment and so forth, right? But Mr. Parent may have may wish to answer other than that.
Maybe it just could give that question to the.
Yeah, well, and I'm going to go to Pierre, but then I'm anxious to go on because I have Mr. Strahl, Ms. Bergen, and Madame Brosseau.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think one thing that I'd like to mention is that this service that we're creating would be fairly different than a service that we currently have for house administration. For the house administration, we serve a corporate role in the sense that, yes, we are advising managers, but we are also advising employees to a certain extent. Whereas if we offer this service to members, members remain their employers for their own employees. So it would be more of an advisory / consulting service with regards to this aspect, because it would be difficult unless we're invited by the member, by the employer, to do an intervention, and we've done some intervention in some members' offices, and we've done it with the invitation of the member or with the whip's intervention. So this is, I think, the most fundamental difference, because we want to respect the fact that each member is their own employer. So we don't want to insert ourselves in your business and managing your own employees unless each member decides to. It will be a journey of discovery, so it is difficult for me to develop a definite roadmap. For instance, for recruitment, we went with the assumption that members didn't require any recruitment assistance. We start to assist members who made these requests to us, and then we were surprised with the amount of requests that we were receiving. So basically, this is a journey of discovery for us. So yes, we plan to adjust to each member, to adjust to the changing nature of your business. So it is difficult for us right now because we only have a small kind of sample of HR case. I mean, we've dealt with some, but not necessarily. I'm sure with the magnitude of 338 members, there's several cases that we weren't involved. I don't know, Robin, if you have anything to add.
So I might just add that you've mentioned a couple things in terms of the roadmap. I think it's important that we make sure that we start with the building blocks. And I think that some of the things that you've mentioned in terms of tools like general job descriptions, performance management tools, these are things that don't currently exist. And I think they will certainly help the employers, the members, better establish requirements in that workplace. The other thing is that our proposals, the senior HR consultants are there for the member, but they can certainly facilitate situations that are ongoing with employees. The other thing is that some of the funding that we're looking at, or some of the roles that we're looking at, are programs that already exist that are interfacing with member staff. So things like the Respectful Workplace Program, the Harassment Prevention Program, a nurse counselor that can meet with employees as well to deal with different situations. So we recognize that there may be longer term an evolution of the service delivery model. We in fact expect it, but as Pierre mentioned, the piece that's missing for us is the data behind it. The other thing is that we don't know how much uptake will come. We expect that we might have some members who frequently use us, others who may decide not to, whether we can't impose our services on them. I think part of it will be through reputation and building those relationships. We also recognize that every time there's a shift in government and representation, that we have to establish new relationships. So some of the things that you've mentioned are some of the building blocks that we need to put in place. And I think when some of those things are in place, it will help us to evolve the service delivery model. The other thing is that with Bill C-65, there will be some obligations that will be placed on members' offices in terms of harassment prevention and also in terms of health and safety. We don't know what that's going to look like yet, but that will also be another opportunity for us to shift and take a look again if we need to look at something different.
Mr. Strahl.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have several concerns here. I would argue that this is well beyond first steps. We're being presented with a solution to an issue that our members might have been reaching out to CHRO. I don't know, but we have not not solicited feedback from our members on what services they feel that CHRO could be providing to them that they are not currently. So this, to me, seems like a bit of a cart before the horse proposal. I'll say that at the outset. Mr. Perron said that desires are being expressed by members. That might be true. That does not necessarily mean that those desires should be met by CHRO, or that we should approve an entirely new apparatus to deal with that. The feeling that I get when I hear this presentation, when I read the details, is that this is being treated like a government department, the Department of the House of Commons, where members of Parliament are in an org chart, and that there's an HR management system that is imposed to, it says to provide services, but when you get into recruitment support, where this organization is going to be sourcing, screening, and helping with interviews, perhaps a bank of resumes will be kept on file. Who makes the determination as to which resumes are forwarded to a member, for instance? We're talking about performance management tools, or there's no goal-setting process. Members of Parliament are not like other, we're not under a global, we're all employees of the House of Commons, and we're in that. We have a unique role. We have a unique perspective on human resources, and I think every member, in my office, we certainly have a goal-setting process. In my office, we have certainly have a performance review operation, and to have that, these things tend to creep where they are offered originally as an option, and then it becomes part of the letter of offer. Was the interview conducted with the CHRO present? Did the resume come through the CHRO? These are things that I see. I can tell you that the members in my caucus will view this very differently perhaps than members in other caucuses, and I think I have deep concerns, quite frankly, about this. It appears to be something that will be imposed on members, and I have never had, and usually when things come to this board, it's a result of members coming to us and saying, I see a need here. We have a problem here where our needs are not being met. So I would suggest that what should be done here is to inform members of their obligations, and there are new obligations coming. There perhaps should be briefing sessions, templates offered to members to say, here is how your operation must change as a result of Bill C-65. Here are your obligations to ensure a safe workplace under this new legislation. But I really do feel this is something that I have not heard, and I will be honest, I have not had a single member come to me in the year and a half that I've been the whip, and we deal with situations all the time. No one has said, I don't feel that the CHRO is serving me well, I need more services from them, and I want to subcontract, if I can put it that way, my obligations and my rights as an employer to another organization. So I would like to see certainly a much more detailed analysis of how, we're talking about 2.83 million, 2.49, but then add on the employee benefits. This is not, if this is a building block, it's a significant one, and from those comments you can say this will only continue to grow. So I would like to see, before this gets approved, an analysis of members should be consulted on if this is what they're after. And while they may have been, certain members may have been expressing their desires to CHRO directly by asking for services, other members have not been asked as to what they would like to see. Maybe they just do it all internally. Maybe they do their own coaching or their own training. So before we approve this, I think members should be consulted. Members should be asked, what do you think CHROs should approve to you? Not simply relying on those who have contacted CHRO, but an actual request for what services would help you in your unique role as a member of Parliament, recognizing again, I know it was said that we respect it, but once this starts to happen, I think members will slowly lose their autonomy as this organization takes on more of those roles that have traditionally fallen to the Member of Parliament. So we have to be very careful that we maintain that this is an advisory service and what are members actually looking for. And I don't think this proposal provides either one of those solutions to me.
Thank you. I think, by the way, that the intent really is that it be an advisory service, but I think your point about it is very important. It should not be something that's imposed. I mean, we have taken steps in some cases where we see where we see big concerns. You know, where we've been incidents that we felt we had to deal with, of course, but that's about things like harassment, as I said earlier. It's a different kind of thing, and it's not the question of. It's not. You know, I think you're absolutely right that we shouldn't be imposing a manner of managing people's offices, rather than. But the question, I think, should be what services can be on offer. But however, I'd like to let Mr. Perron answer.
Yeah, and I agree. I think this service will be optional for members, so that's the intent. And as I said earlier, this would not be a typical corporate HR. This will be more of an advisory to members who require it and who need it. So the tools that will be offered to individual members will be tools that we develop that will be optional, that could be modified by members if they want to. They could be used or not by members. So that's the orientation that we'd like to take.
I have Ms. Bergen.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your presentation. I think building on what Mr. Strahl talked about, I know my initial thought when I saw the heading, this is new human resources services for members as employers. My thought was, I wondered if our whips had been consulted as to what our members are expressing. Are there challenges when it comes to how they manage their employees? It sounds like that hadn't been done, and that might be a good place to start. If we want to be, it looks like it's going to be $2.5 million a year being spent on helping our members be better employers. I think we should go back and find out what their unique challenges are and what the services are that they're looking for. I mean, Mr. Holland's description, very, very different than my own personal experience and where I think I've got challenges. You know, I'm from a rural riding. My biggest challenges is with my employees who aren't here in Ottawa. And having somebody here in Ottawa, like that they're going to phone, and they can barely get IT dealt with. I'm pretty certain they're not. There are other challenges that there may not be an easy fix. So there's one example. Another example is the whole idea around setting goals. You know, there may be some appetite for members of Parliament to have a template developed on how do you sit down and do a goal setting with your employees. That's a template. That's like when we have to give letters to our employees and we go to legal services and you say, here's the template. Or even another great parallel example is there's services for our 10%ers, which we can use House of Commons services to develop our 10%ers, or we use entirely our own imagination and what we know is good for our own riding. And that's where I could see this possibly going, but it would need to start with us knowing that this now is a new thing. Probably before that's even established, let our members know what the new requirements will be under the new legislation. From that, they can have discussions with our whips as to what they believe that they will need, and then out of that, this could be developed whereby needs are actually being addressed. It may end up being, when you think of something like CRG, for example, for us at CRG, for the Liberals, it's our resource services, where it actually doesn't come out of House administration. It's just a budget amount that's given to each of the parties. And those parties work with their members. in order to address that. I'm not suggesting that would be the solution, but I think what I'm seeing is if this is meant to be services for members as employers, we have definitely put the cart before the horse, and I'm afraid that the goals will not be met at all, which would not be, I believe, satisfactory to anybody. So I think we need to go back to the drawing board, find out what the challenges are that our members are having in terms of their employees, and then be able to address them through our WIPs.
Madame Brosseau.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank Mr. Parent and Madame Daigle for the presentation. At first blush, looking at this, it made me think back of when I came in 2011. It was a whirlwind. When you get to the Hill, walking up, being in the House of Commons for the first time, and then all the training. Because as soon as you're elected, you want to learn what your job in Ottawa is and get set up as fast as possible back in the constituency. So I can't remember anything that happened orientation-wise because I was just trying to get as much done as possible. So I think it's important to make sure that, you know, we do evaluate the service, the needs of members, and make sure that if we do go ahead with new HR services and programs, that it does kind of address the needs of members of Parliament. And when I found out that there's this recruitment system that's going to, you know, be proposed, and there have been recruitment services offered to certain MPs, you know, I just wonder if that kind of blurs the line between House administration and you know, MPs' duties and responsibilities. And, you know, I was wondering if there's any kind of risks that, you know, could arise in a situation where the House administration, you know, does recruitment, does interviews, does background checks, and, you know, if there's something that was missed, if that can cause a, you know, a problem, and what kind of recourse would there be for MPs that, you know, use this recruitment system. For us, it's a little bit different. You know, we have a collective agreement, we're unionized, so I think, you know, I think this is a good idea, but I think what we really need to do is talk to MPs, maybe go back to WIPs and see what other kind of services would be needed. I'm happy that, you know, we're talking about health and safety, but I think we need to also make sure that we have enough information around mental health for our offices, making sure that, you know, MPs know what kind of supports are available for staff. So I think this is a really interesting. I'm for this, but I'm just kind of worried, and I think we need a little bit more information. And like it was mentioned, you know, once the recruitment services were, you know, offered to one member, boule de neige, other MPs kind of found out about it. I've never heard of this being offered until we had a briefing about it. And the fact that we're only going to have 8 senior consultants and then 10 program and services representatives in the HR department. I'm just wondering if, you know, that's going to be enough, because they're going to seem to have a lot of work to do. So I guess, you know, those are kind of my concerns around this.
Could I ask that we go back to the previous slide for just a second? I think it might be helpful. In the fourth bullet, there's a number of things listed. The first one, of course, relates to the recruitment issues, but the others are managing sick leave and mental health situations, accommodating employees with special needs, health and safety, and navigating conflict and harassment complaints. I wonder to what degree the concerns that members have are with the first of those as opposed to the others, or is it with all of them? And let me just be very clear that from my perspective, the independence of members is extremely important, and that, you know, their rights to manage their offices, I consider, and I appreciate when members have said about that, I consider that to be vitally important. So I have Mr. Holland and Mr. Strahl.
So, Mr. Speaker's suggestion, it occurs to me in listening to the conversation that there's work to do, that we need to go back and have some conversations about the different ways that the different needs that we have or don't have, as the case may be, and how those can be made manifest. I don't think, as an example, that any of this I'm suggesting should be mandatory. I'm suggesting that I would certainly go to our members of our caucus and make a strong suggestion that it would be wise to use some of these things. But if our members made a suggestion that they didn't want to, that would absolutely be their choice. So if I take screening as an example, I also don't have a problem. Ms. Bergen said, well, perhaps that should reside on the political side of the House, so that we're doing our own screening, or we're given the ability to do the screening there. I wouldn't have a problem with that as an example, but I do think having that service is incredibly essential. There's a lot of members who come to me regular. I don't know how to evaluate the skill. I want to hire somebody. I need them to be able to do this. I don't know how to evaluate that. If you're elected and you are a professional, let's say you were a doctor, you may never manage somebody. You certainly may not have managed it in this context. So having somebody that can help you with that screening, I think, is incredibly important. A performance management system usually is rooted in evidence and in practice. So yes, we can invent our own performance management systems. Of course, we're welcome to do that. I would encourage our members to use something that has been tried, tested, and has some kind of universality to it. But the expectation would be very much on our side of the fence. We wouldn't, share the performance evaluation with, CHRO. It would be for the utilization of the member. Anyway, all of this is to say that I think personally these changes are essential. That for us to operate as a modern workforce, these are things that we need and need urgently, I would say. But I can see that there's a lot of conversations that need to take place, and rather than sort of having a big debate here, I would suggest that maybe we just table this and get the opportunity to have some conversations first with ourselves, so that we can understand what our needs are and where each of us are coming from on this, and how it can be bounded to manage some of the concerns that have been expressed. And then we can then have a conversation with some folks about the path forward from there.
Good. Mr. Strahl.
Yes, I would agree. I would also ask for some direction from CHRO to provide us with the questions that they perhaps asked themselves when they were creating this program, to say what services do members, are they looking for, where I'm sure there's metrics about what you are asked for out of all, as people come to you, here's what they're asking for. But there is a number of members who, I would submit, have never contacted CHRO for, but have identified gaps perhaps that they would like to see assistance with. So I would agree with Mr. Holland that we should come back to this, that we should be given an opportunity to take it off to our members, because I think what will provoke some concern is that this is not simply a request in the supplementary estimates for, look, the CHRO is overwhelmed with requests, we need more money to hire more people. This is, we are setting up something new, and here's what it can deliver. So that, I think, is where members will want to have some input into what is being proposed. And if this is a matter of just needing more money for more people to carry out the tasks we already ask of the CHRO, perhaps people will be more comfortable with it. But it seems to me it's it says right on it, a new service delivery model. It requires new management and administrative staff. So if this is a new function, we need buy-in from members, and members should be the ones crafting it. And I think we can do that. We may maybe we'll end up with the exact same program, but I don't think we should start with that assumption. So I would agree with Mr. Holland that we should, I don't know if we want to set a deadline for the new fiscal year, that this would be something that we would be looking for, but certainly I think we would be uncomfortable proceeding with the plan that's been laid out for us at this time.
Well, I think it's been a very helpful conversation, regardless. Mr. Perrant, do you have anything to tell us about where this sprung from?
Well, we've been involved in several cases, whether it's termination, assisting members in having difficult conversation with regards to termination, health and safety. Sometimes we've had, probably the most challenging case with regards to health and safety was managed in a member's office. We assisted a member in managing a very, very difficult medical case. We've interfaced with nurses and doctors and professionals, health professionals, to assist the member in managing this case. So this is a good example where there was a need, and we had the resources internally, and that we offered these resources to this member who was in dire needs of this services. Same issue with regards to recruiting. A member was looking for resumes for a downtown Toronto office. So we went on LinkedIn and obtained some resumes for the members. So we didn't make decision on behalf of the member. We just assisted the member in dealing with a very pressing HR issue. So these are examples where this came from, and of course these members talked to their colleagues and said, well, if you're going through something difficult, you may want to talk to Pierre or Robin. So this is kind of the genesis of where it came from.
So are you overwhelmed at this point? Oh, you are overwhelmed.
Yes.
All right, that's good. I think that's useful to know that, but I think it's also useful for members of the board to discuss this with their members. And I mean, on the one hand, I was going to say make them aware that these services are services that not all members may know are available. On the other hand, if they're already overwhelmed, that's a challenge. But the main thing is to have that conversation, and I think that's vital. So thank you very much. Merci beaucoup. Maintenant, on tourne.
Thank you very much. Now we'll move on to computer and IT management for the riding officers. Welcome Mr. Stéphane Aubé, who is the Chief Information Officer.
Oops. Monsieur Aubé, bienvenue.
Welcome, Mr. Aubé.
This presentation today is a follow-up to a presentation we did in the spring. In the spring, we had came to the proposal to the board to launch a pilot with 60 to 70 members' offices in order to strengthen the IT security posture in the constituency offices. Also ensure parity between what's offered as a service between the Hill and constituency offices. We also wanted to standardize the service delivery in the constituency offices. And we also wanted to provide more simplicity to purchasing of equipment for the members in the constituency offices. So we're back here today after the pilot, where more than 70% of the offices have been set up, and we've received great feedback. And the outcome of the pilot is that we're seeking support from the board to offer a managed set of computers for constituency offices. We're proposing that every constituency offices have centrally funded computers, jusqu'à un maximum de 5 ordinateurs.
Maximum of 5 computers.
Constituency offices could buy an additional 5 computers through their MOBs if required by the members. We're also proposing that any computers that are purchased from the constituency offices are leveraging a supply chain that will be set up from the house for security reasons. And in addition to that, based on the feedback that we received during the pilot, members are also requesting that we provide compatible printing solutions in the constituency offices. And we're also proposing that the existing model of funding for the network connectivity between the constituency offices and the Hill be reviewed to be centrally funded versus the MOB. So this is the proposal we're making here, sir. And as outlined, it's very important for us that we move forward for security reasons. We're making this recommendation. Security and the constituency offices are the highest vector of attack when it comes to security to the Hill. And we want to leverage this initiative and also improve the services to the members by putting forward this proposal. So I'll just open up the question, sir.
Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup. Mr. Strahl.
Thank you. As the person who chose the Conservative members who would receive this, the pilot, happy to report that I made the list, and that we do have the computers. They were installed fairly recently, so I think the initial report has been good to have that integrated system where you can access shared drives and all the rest of it. Has been very useful. My question, and I know I wasn't sure if this was a feature of the pilot or if it was a feature going forward. It says provide each member up to 5 managed computing devices. Now, I have 2 full-time employees in my office and myself who's there a limited amount, but when I'm there, I do use a computer. And we were told that that then would be the limit. It would be 3 computers would be provided because that's the number of employees that I had on file. Now, we do also have volunteers. We do also have a server, those sorts of things. So that's my first question would be, how will you determine the up to 5? Is that a determination made by the member or by administration? Secondly, if you get in, I was pleased to hear that you wanted to make sure the printers worked with these things. That's critical. However, some of the BizHub, the all-in-one units that we all have here and many of us have in our constituency offices were, at the time anyways, they're in the range between $5,000 and $10,000, I think, for those units. So are you suggesting then that would become part of the standard offer that would go to the House administration budget, or are we just talking about you'll make sure the printers that we've purchased through our MOB are working with the new computers before the installers pack up and go? So those are my 2 questions.
Thank you, sir. In the past, sir, there used to be a limit with the number of employees. This would limit the number of computers that they could be purchasing. But with this proposal, sir, the proposal will be determined by the member. So the member will be able to actually receive from the central fund up to 5 computers, sir. The average through the pilot has been around 4.2. So depending on different members, we've seen an average around 4.2 computers per area, sir. So this for the first question. For the printing solution, sir, we're not proposing a particular solution. We're proposing working with your office, sir, to understand the needs, and then proposing a solution that could come forward. So if someone wants the photocopier type printing that we have here on the Hill, from a parity perspective, we could offer that. But if they also want a lower end solution, sir, from our vendors, leveraging our supply chain, we'll be able to provide that and customize that by working with your office specifically, sir.
When you say you offer that, does that mean that will come out of the central budget?
Yes.
I guess what will come out of the central budget is actually the acquisition of the asset, right, not the actual usage of it. Right. But you'll see that because of our own supply chain and the volume we buy for the Hill, our costs are significantly less than $5,000 or $10,000 for those machines.
And that is currently a requirement, is it not, if you're purchasing that kind of IT equipment? Like, would that be something that we would require members to do then, to use that? We used to have the Constituency Improvement Fund. It required you to purchase through a certain track. But I guess what I'm asking who our members will be interested, out of which envelope this will come, and if they choose to go to a local supplier, does that then come out of their MOBs? If it's not purchased through you, does it then come out of MOBs? And if they purchase it themselves, is that allowed, and will you still service it?
So for computers, sir, we're proposing that all computers be purchased through the House as vehicles. So we would prevent the opportunity from buying through local suppliers. Because for security reasons, we want to ensure that we have the same image on these computers that we have on the Hill. For printing solutions, sir, we're also proposing that we leverage the vehicles that we have on the House, by which we will offer a variety, but with specific brands that we have certified and integrated into the computing solution, sir.
Thank you.
Mr. Hall.
So just on that point, if I could just understand, so the existing inventory of computers, so for example, some of which are networked in, some of which aren't. So for example, there's, in my constituency office, a person who's doing the graphic and design and whatnot isn't integrated in, they use a laptop that isn't integrated into the network at all. So everything that was purchased would have to be linked into the House of Commons network and be interfacing with it. You wouldn't be able to have anything that's outside of that network. And what would you do with the existing inventory of computers, some of which are networked into the House of Commons and some of which aren't?
So Speaker, first let me answer the second one because it's going to help answer the second one, sir. So anything that would be required to be connected to the infrastructure, okay, we would want it to be a house machine because of the standards. Now, recognizing that some constituency offices have computers that have been bought in the last year, the last 2 years, we're not planning to replace them until they reach the end of their life cycle. Okay, so we would be working with each of the offices to determine what the appropriate scenario. Just when moving forward, when we life cycle these equipment, we would then move to leveraging the ones that we have. Now, recognizing that there will always be the option for the computers that are bought, leveraging our standing offers, to have them or have them not on the network if there are specialized tools that would require that, sir.
Okay, and so one of the reasons, and again, I'm not using it, and I'm trying to project this across all of our caucus, so I'm just taking my issue to understand it more broadly, because no doubt that if I have the issue, others will. In circumstances where there are, because it could be quite restrictive to get a program loaded onto the computer, right? Because you don't have control over your own computer. You have to effectively get permission from your department in order to be able to download a program. So if somebody wants to be able to put a program on, you know, and I don't know if you're in graphic design or whatnot, maybe they're using a platform that you haven't approved, or so in the future, everything will have to reside effectively and be controlled by you, so that nobody will be able to evade that. And if that's the case, how will we deal with that? Because in the past, there have been issues with trying to, I mean, when I was first an MP, this is going back a long ways, I wasn't allowed to put spell check on my BlackBerry, right? Because it wasn't an approved application. So how are we going to avoid the kind of circumstances where there's software or innovations that the members want to be able to use, and potentially there's a long lag time before they're allowed or approved to put it on their own computers for use?
Mr. Speaker, so compared to the past, sir, we're not planning to do that. So if someone would come with a device that would be required, it would be managed on an exception by exception basis. We will allow it. For example, we do allow in certain cases, Macintosh devices or Apple devices for particular graphic solutions that cannot be performed on the environment that we have. And we do accept these solutions, sir. We just don't attach them to our network. So this will be allowed moving forward. If such a thing, if you're looking, and again, for the software aspect, for example, if you're looking for a piece of software that would not run on our infrastructure, what we're proposing as a first step is to work with you to see if you can run that on our PCs, okay? Run it on our PCs, maybe not on our network, but we can have it on a standalone in your office, because we can still manage it through the internet. And then if that doesn't work, sir, well, then we'll find another exception and working with you how to make that happen. This is why we're proposing a series of machines that are funded centrally and a series of machines that are funded through the MOB, sir. We're just trying to standardize the machines so that we don't end up with a large variety of assets that we can't really recycle after an election after that.
Okay, and the only asterisk, if I could, sorry, the only asterisk I would place beside my support for this is that caveat. I just don't want to see us in a circumstance where there's software or something that is required in order to be able to do the business of a member, where there's a huge process to be able to install that onto a computer, or somebody being told, sorry, we're not allowing that because we've decided that we don't approve that software, I guess is what I would say.
And Mr. Speaker, I can attest that this is the case. Like, we're even planning, all we're saying is even that machine, sir, that would be running that software, all we're asking is that it's not attached to the network, but you can use it in your office.
Fair enough.
We'd give you an image that you can work with. All we want to do is standardize the machines there, sir.
Fair enough, thank you.
But if you absolutely you will allow people to install, provided that there's not a problem, right? Okay, good. Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I hope Stefan would know that I appreciate the efforts. It's something that I think we've been long overdue to do. We need to be able to have our computers communicating between Parliament Hill and our constituencies because work in both areas is essential to the work we do. I just do want to point out, and I know we've had some interactions in regards to what we anticipated the pilot to be and the fact that it's taken longer than anticipated. So I do want to manage expectations as to when we thought we'd get computers versus when we got them. Because I know I've received the computers because I was chosen to be part of the pilot, but they are just being networked, I guess, this week. So I just want to, when we're taking on a lot larger than a pilot, to be mindful of the time it would take. I look at the pilot project, the whole purpose of it was to hear examples such as what my colleague is mentioning. So I'm assuming that you have some examples where you've had to look at those exemptions to ensure that the programs or services that our colleagues are requesting are able to be part of it. I'm just also wanting to confirm that if a device is not on the network, that it is able to communicate, therefore, with the printing machine and so forth that might be coming out of this budget. I look at the costs that are just under $1 million for 2019-2020, and then they go up to 1.5. And I'm wondering if that's because of the pilot project has taken some of them, and then you're looking at numbers to service all of them. I also wonder, and I know I've asked you this before, is when it comes to an election year, there's always some changes. Currently what happens is devices belong to the member's office, and if there is a changeover, you receive those devices. To ensure security and so forth, how are we going to ensure that we are going to keep that, and are those computers going to stay with the office, or do new ones get set when a new member's there? And I will make the point that if the number for 2019-2020 has the same resources or same number of devices and so forth available as the ones after 2021 moving forward, and it's cheaper to be buying new devices every year, we might want to look at our options.
Okay. So a few questions. Let's just start with the election, Madam Speaker. At an election, the process from the House is to recuperate all security information that is on the devices and cleanly restart the devices. So we do this personally, either on site or from here. So we either get back the hard disk and we treat them in the way based on our protocols to ensure that there's no security risk to these machines. Okay. As far as any device that would not be attached to the network, would they be able to leverage the different other devices that are in the constituency offices? Yes, they will be. We're going to work with each of the individual offices, as we will be doing in your office on December 3rd, being scheduled. We're going to be working with the staff, establishing what the requirements are, and moving forward with establishing a solution that will meet your requirements. You're right, it did take a little bit longer, and that's why you've seen that through the pilot. There's multiple reasons. Sometimes it's availability of the members. Sometimes it's also the ability of our vendors to provide us the services. And also it's a new model because now we're entering into servicing the constituency offices remotely with third parties, because this model that we're proposing is a shared partnership with industry. So we're going to be leveraging cross-Canada partner that's going to be working in the constituency offices. It's also been a learning lesson for them. It's been a learning lesson for us. And we're working on it. We're taking that back. And then it's also why when you look at an election, we're not planning a big bang approach. We would be planning this over like a year and a half. Like there would be a transition based on what exists right now, and we'd be going from office to office with a large group of people. And as you saw in the budget, we're seeking for additional funding during election period, and then this funding goes down after an election. So the standard funding we're seeking for is for the resources to provide the ongoing support, but in an election we're seeking additional funding that would be sourced through the existing budgets of the House in order to meet the higher capacity.
So I guess to add to that point, as you see, yes, the funding is ramping up, and because you've already mentioned that it was a challenge to get out even in the pilot project. So we realize that we can't do the big bang right after the election. So the year of the election, we're ramping up some portion, and then the following year we'll finish the rollout of all of the computers that we have, and also that means that we're respecting some of the life cycling of machines that have been recently purchased. So we're not asking for all of the funding to roll this out the first year. We'll do as much as we can. We have almost a 60-40 split of what we can do in the first year, and then get up to full capacity during the second. So that's why the ramping up of the funding.
The question I would just follow up, thank you. The question I would follow up with is about the third-party vendors and how they're chosen. I'll tell you, part of being the Member of Parliament is being able to use services within my riding and supporting our small businesses. So I would like to know how you are choosing them, and then how are you ensuring their security. And because my printer, I'll tell you, in my riding, when it gets used a lot. And then when it's broken, So I need somebody to be able to come in readily to be able to fix it, because there's usually not a backup device. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. We do have standing offers or competitive vehicles that we created, and we had sought someone that had the ability to provide the service across Canada, because we wanted to work with one vendors, easier from a management perspective. But if this does not meet the requirements of individual offices, Madam Speaker, is something certainly that we're going to take feedback and see how we can adapt the vehicle, because the point is, if we have to manage it through regions, we've done that in the past with the networking service providers. We've worked with individual providers in areas, for example, the Maritimes, Ontario, Quebec, and in out west. So we have the ability to do that. Right now we're working with one vendor because it was the process to start, but it's certainly feedback. If we find that we're not meeting the requirements from a service perspective, being able to react quickly to you, we will do so. But having said that, that one vendor is a vendor that has the ability to create relationship with multiple vendors in all the areas. So they are leveraging other suppliers in the areas and working with them in these areas. That's the approach that we were looking for. But we'll certainly take that feedback and measure that, and if it becomes an issue, we'll certainly look at addressing it in partnership with the finance people.
We're running up against the time. I know House leaders tend to get very busy shortly. Madame Brosseau.
It really wasn't an urgent question. I was just going to ask about the life cycle of computers, but we don't really have to go there. And I just had some questions more around what happens when we do replace computers. Do they get cleaned up, wiped, and resold? I'm just more thinking environmentally how this plays out, but I'm all for adopting this. I think it is great, the fact that we could connect the Hill and our constituencies, but a problem in rural ridings that I represent a rural riding, and I'm sure I have a lot of colleagues. Internet is a big issue, and when they installed the new, because I'm part of the pilot project, when they installed the new computers, it was delayed because they had to fix something with the internet, bring in a box, extra specialists. So I would just maybe like some more information around environment and how the government is working to make sure that we respect that, and I guess that's my big question.
Okay. You have a quick answer on that?
So the life cycle is 4 to 5 years. From a security perspective, we take the hard disk and we destroy them. We take them back here and we destroy them, wipe them, so that there's no damage, and then it gets recycled through a recycle process.
Because I have companies in my writing that do recycling of computers, so that's very interested in how.
So we do have a recycling process.
As we continue this conversation, I suspect there might be a willingness to deal with this at the beginning of the next meeting. We can approve this?
But we can ask questions later, but I think I'm okay with approving it.
Is that's agreeable to approve this?
My suggestion was going to be that we approve this, and if there's further questions, maybe we can have Mr. Aubé come back at another time for just general discussion, but I thought our time is running out and we could approve this.
Members can let me know when they want to have him come back. How's that sound? Okay, we'll approve this then. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup. And the rest of the agenda will defer to the next meeting, Mr. Strahl.
Ms. Bergen.
Yeah, if I could, what I was going, that was going to be the beginning, my first comment, and I'm glad we got that done. I'm also just wondering, because we're not going to have time to go through the other items, 2 points that I would like the committee to consider. If maybe next week when we come back, I think on item number 5, financial matters, that those proposals, I know we are looking for more details. We would be asking for more details. We'd like a more detailed report, and I think subsequent to the discussion around the services for MPs in terms of employees, that probably would need to be revised anyway. Secondly, we're wondering if maybe we should try to meet a little bit earlier so that we can get through everything. We've got a number of issues in camera that will need to be addressed before we rise for Christmas. Should we possibly meet half an hour earlier to give us enough time?
I think we can look at that, and I guess we can ask your office, the deputy clerk, to work with your offices to try to see if that can be coordinated. And thank you very much. Meeting is adjourned.